Welcome to IMEO's The MENA Mix Regional Recap. I'm your host, Manny Jad, and today we're closing out Season 1 with the special Year in Review episode. It has been a remarkable year, full of rich conversation, sharp analysis, and honest reflections on the major developments shaping the Middle East and North Africa. We're grateful to our listeners for joining us throughout this journey, and we're already looking forward to launching Season 2 in January. To help us look back on the defining moments of 2025, the turning points, the overlooked crises, and the emerging trends, we're joined by three extraordinary guests. First, Ambassador Angelina Eichhorst, the EU ambassador to Egypt and the Arab League, whose decades of diplomatic experience have shaped Europe's engagement across the region. Second, His Excellency Bisher al-Khawassna, Jordanian senator and former Prime Minister of Jordan, bringing deep insight into regional diplomacy and governance. And third, Ambassador Dennis Ross, counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washinton Institute for Near East Policy, one of the United States' most experienced Middle East negotiators. We are honored to have all of you with us today. From Gaza to Sudan, from the Red Sea to Sahel, 2025 didn't just test diplomacy, it tested empathy, consistency, and political courage. We saw the limits of ceasefires, the fragility of normalization, the persistence of conflict, and the resilience of people caught in the middle. And today, with the three of the region's most seasoned voices, we're going to break it all down: what shifted, what stalled, and what might still surprise us in 2026. Let's start off with Gaza and Israel. In 2025, the Gaza war shifted from military confrontation to a political standoff over governance, borders, and humanitarian collapse. A fragile ceasefire brokered by US, Egypt, and Qatar diplomacy, as well as Trump's re-engagement, remains shaky. Israel's settlement expansion surged, Palestinian divisions deepened, and with 2025 winding down, the ceasefire remains fragile, leaving critical questions about what comes next. So I pose this question to the three of you. What does the 2025 ceasefire reveal about the limits of diplomacy in a war shaped by deep political and humanitarian fault lines?
Who would you like to start?
Dennis?
Okay. Look, I think one of the things it reveals is that diplomacy tends to work when you have a variety of different circumstances combining themselves. What do I mean by that? First, timing. One of the reasons in the end you got the deal you did was because everyone seemed to be ready to say, okay, let's find a way to end it. You didn't have that convergence before. Secondly, leverage. In my experience in diplomacy, without leverage, you never really produce outcomes. The leverage is defined both positively and negatively. You put pressure on those so they understand the cost of saying no, but also you help provide explanations or you provide inducements. Clearly, when it came to the Trump administration, there was a readiness to use leverage in a way it had not been using it before. I often said I was surprised only by one thing, not the fact that President Trump would use the leverage, but I was surprised that it took so long to apply it. I always felt there was what I called a sell-by date when it came to his patience for seeing this war go on. And I think the attack on Doha ordered by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that kind of crossed that line because the Qataris, I think some of the Saudis and Emiratis dealt directly with the president after that, and that was for him, enough was enough. Now, does that guarantee that we're going to move into phase two? Does that guarantee we're going to see all the elements of the 20-point plan implemented? The answer is obviously no, but again, it comes back to the factors I've been talking about, the question of timing, the question of interest, the question of the leverage that is going to be applied. So we're at a point now where the president is talking about we're ready to move into phase two. All but one of the bodies of hostages now have been returned. What does phase two mean? Phase two fundamentally means the disarming of Hamas, so there can be demilitarization in Gaza, because there won't be reconstruction in Gaza without demilitarization. That's not an argument, it's a fact, because who's going to invest in it if they think Hamas can reconstitute itself. The disarming is critical to getting Israeli withdrawal. So you have a kind of nexus between disarming, withdrawal, reconstruction. The mechanism for getting Hamas to disarm is not at all clear. There's a negotiation going on. Hamas is very clear in terms of saying they won't completely disarm. On the other hand, they're signaling they might be prepared to turn over some weapons. One of the issues with the 20 points is that each point is understood differently by every actor. So
Correct, yes.
that was necessary maybe to get the ceasefire and the release of all the live hostages. But now you're moving into a different phase where there needs to be much more understanding of what needs to be done. I won't go on forever. Let me just conclude with this thought. I think it was a mistake not to have, at least at the point when the Security Council endorsed the 20 points, it was a mistake not to have announced the people who are going to make up the Board of Peace the same day, not to announce the apolitical Palestinian technocratic committee, and not to announce at least who was going to be contributing to the International Stabilization Force. All that was important because Hamas is trying also to create the impression that it's not going anyplace. We know that the public in Gaza wants a different future, but they're also fearful of the kind of threats that Hamas can make to them. The more you create a sense that there is an alternative to Hamas, the more you're in a position where I think you can affect what Hamas's behavior is as well. So I gather there will be some announcement soon about the Board of Peace, even an executive committee for the Board of Peace, the Palestinian Technocratic Committee. It seems the International Stabilization Force is still lagging somewhat behind, but my impression is there will be some announcements soon. My guess is they will come before Prime Minister Netanyahu actually visits President Trump on December 29th.
Do you think that is it a red line or a hard no for Israel to keep Hamas without weapons or any kind of military on?
Look, I think that the objective of demilitarization of Gaza, I think, is shared by everybody. How you get to demilitarization, there is no consensus on. I think from the Israeli standpoint, the argument is, yes, Hamas has to be disarmed. But by the way, nobody has defined what is disarmament. Is
Yes.
disarmament every weapon that every Hamas operative has? Well, that'll never take place. Is disarmament, the remaining missiles, the anti-tank missiles, the mortars? That makes more sense. It was never going to be achieved all at once, so there does need to be a process. And by the way, if you read the point in the 20 points, it does talk about a process. It talks about it being monitored. It talks about decommissioning. It in a sense creates implicitly some thresholds or some basically targets to be achieved. Again, there was a kind of presumption that the International Stabilization Force is the one that's going to be presiding over the disarmament. It seems that Egypt is trying to negotiate more an acquiescence of Hamas. Your question is, how hard and fast is this? What does it mean? Clearly, I think, as I said before, not only are all the 20 points interpreted differently, I have no doubt there are multiple definitions of what this means with different parties. Does Egypt view it the same way the Israelis do? I doubt that. Does the United States view it the same way the Israelis do? I would say the Trump administration probably is more open to a process than the Israelis are. The Israelis can be persuaded, provided this process looks like it's credible and not just a kind of cover to go through the motions, but Hamas retains its ability to coerce everybody because it basically retains its weapons. Last point on this. Hamas is dramatically weaker than it was. Anybody who says otherwise is ignoring the reality. They are dramatically weaker than they were. But they're still the strongest force within Gaza today. And there is no stomach on the part of any of the forces that would come in as part of the National Stabilization Force to go and directly confront Hamas. That doesn't seem to be anybody who's signing up for this seems to be prepared to accept that. One of the issues about why it's so hard to get the International Stabilization Force up and running is because there isn't an agreement on what the mandate is. I
Mm-hmm.
personally would prefer the mandate to be one of law and order and protection of the public. I think that in itself would actually change the psychic landscape in Gaza. It would also make it harder for Hamas to resist what's going on. But that's still something to be worked out, and clearly it has not been.
Thank you. Bashir, what's the viewpoint from MENA region and more specifically from Jordan on the 20-point plan,
Uh,
Hamas, Gaza, all of that?
First of all, thank you, Manny, for hosting us, and I wish to thank Dennis for his thoughts on this issue, which I agree with almost in the entirety of his presentation vis-a-vis what are the driving forces behind reaching the ceasefire. Uh, I'd like to stress and emphasize that both the questions of timing and leverage were very
Mm-hmm.
crucial, and I think it boiled down ultimately to the issue of the leverage that President Trump was willing to basically exact on and invest time into to reach the ceasefire, and subsequently the momentum behind the plan, and subsequently Resolution 2803. Uh, uh, the plan is creatively ambiguous in each and every point, and I think that basically this is not an omission. This is something that's quite deliberate. It's promising. It does carry from the standpoint of the Arab world in general, and the Middle East in general, the prospect of a future political horizon that has been missing between the Palestinians and Israelis, subject to the right conditions. And of course, it was preceded, as Ambassador Ross correctly stipulated, it was preceded even by a statement coming from the Coalition for the Two-State Solution, which reflected the general consensus that really Hamas does not have a role to play in the administration of Gaza the day after. And the issue of laying down arms or disarmament is certainly an extremely important issue that equates in importance and that's reciprocated with the complete phased withdrawal to the buffer zone. And President Trump today was quite clear on the question that the yellow line is not going to be the line that fundamentally carries any permanence in terms of the presence of the IDF in and within Gaza. There is hope about the plan. There is discomfort by some players in the Middle East about what are the requirements of the ISF, what is the mandate of the ISF, whether it's enforcement or peacekeeping. The resolution came and fundamentally stipulated that it's more on the enforcement side of the equation vis-a-vis disarmament and keeping the peace. And to that end, I think that there are concerns vis-a-vis the contribution of forces, while the issue of disarmament is not resolved one way or the other. What concerns a lot of countries in the region, and mainly a country like Jordan, in my estimation, and today I cannot speak on behalf of the officialdom of the Hashemat Kingdom of Jordan. I'm no longer an executive of the
Mm-hmm.
government of Jordan, but naturally I can definitely analyze what the position would be based on my long experience. Is that Jordan cannot contribute in such a force for a multitude of reasons. That basically it would, with the lack of clarity of the mandate, it would be quite difficult to place our soldiers in harm's way. And I think that this position has been echoed by others in the region too. And yes, this issue of the contribution is lagging behind as a result of the lack of clarity on the mandate and on the issue of disarmament and on the issue, frankly speaking, also of the extent of Israeli withdrawals. But most importantly, as a result of a pervading wait-and-see mode vis-a-vis the post-management side of the 20 points, and whether we will get to a point where there might be conditions and there should be conditions for the regeneration of the political horizon that would aim to establish conditions for resuming the dialogue that aims at the crystallization of a two-state solution when the conditions are right.
Mm-hmm.
And it also hinges on the attitude on the near future, long-term future, and past attitude of the current Israeli government vis-a-vis the policies in the West Bank. And that's not promising because the past few years have seen extremely aggressive unilateral measures in the West Bank. They've witnessed heightened settler violence and an array of daily unilateral measures that fundamentally do incrementally amount to creeping annexation of the West Bank while not announcing it politically. Definitely, President Trump's repeated announcements, including the announcements in the media that he would oppose annexation, is something that's quite welcome. But the issue of linking the 20-point plan at some point in time to a political horizon is fundamental and essential for countries in the region. Certainly, it is essential for Jordan because Jordan still believes that probably the product of last year, 2025, is maybe to assuage concerns vis-a-vis a spoiler in the region by maybe addressing the issue of the overstretch of Iran in terms of employing and deploying proxies in the region that were upsetters. But we still have the feeling that is validated by action that also the current Israeli government, with its attitude, even reviewed security posture, and behavior and demeanor, is equally an upsetter that has to be dealt with politically, and that has to be brought into and when I say brought, mainly by the USA, brought into a commitment to be disciplined in its approach that can continue to disturb the region and take it back to a cycle of violence and confrontation. And history in the Middle East tells us that usually those cycles, each and every cycle, happens to be much more aggressive than the preceding cycle, witnessed by what we have seen during the October 7th attack and heinous crimes, and the equally subsequent heinous crimes that were exacted on civilians in Gaza.
Thank you, Bashir. Angelina, what's the viewpoint from Europe, please?
Thanks, Manny. Thanks to everybody. First, let me agree with Ambassador Ross on the question of timing, really. And he was very clear in saying, in fact, with the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, also all the rest should have been announced, because I mentioned timing looking back the whole year. I think we have all collectively tried to exert as much as efforts. As you know, I'm based in Egypt, and from the Egyptian perspective, it has been very clear there's no time to lose. And I think it's the same for Jordan and everybody else. Throughout the year, all these efforts done to try to get to a ceasefire. There was one, just recall January, beginning of the year. It was good. It was holding. People were crossing. Assistance came in, etc. We shouldn't forget that all the work that was done in putting a proposal to the table for early recovery, for reconstruction, adopted by the League of Arab States, by the Organization of Islamic States. That was a pretty solid start. It was not a complete plan because governance security. We know why that didn't take it really forward where perhaps it could have ended. But what was important, all these efforts were done to try to stop the violence. And that is what Sharm el-Sheikh really did. And I think the leverage mentioned there by Ambassador Ross is very important. But we are still at the point now where timing is of huge essence, because again, we look back 2 months where it's a fragile ceasefire. The other speakers mentioned exactly what's going on right now. I can see here in Cairo very much an urgency of let's now move on, let's work, let's fill the vacuums that are being left. And this is something the European Union supports. First, that the plan has to work. We will do all our best. And that's from the European Union angle. And I think there are many Arab players in the region as well who want to make this work, right?
Yes.
And that's very important to keep that in mind. There's a very there's a constructive attitude to really make this now happen. But there is the timing issue where I think we are all struggling with, because things do take time. And I remember in Sharm el-Sheikh, I was assisting our leaders who were present there. You could see that many were saying, oh, this is going to take quite some time. We don't have that. This is not possible. So hopefully 26 will get us a little bit in a mode of further operations. We cannot deny what has been put on the ground, the elements that have been worked. They were mentioned by both Bisher and Dennis, but still, that's the point. The ceasefire has to hold. The assistance has to flood in.
Yes.
That is a key point the European Union has been making from day one, and we will continue to make that point, because the assistance does not get in sufficiently. Yes, there are movements. I won't go into detail, but that's it. And then the third point is really, don't undermine, in all the efforts that we're trying to do now, undermine the if you like, the ownership of the Palestinians. This is important because the horizon was mentioned before, the political horizon, Bisher said it, but you really need to make sure that there is a process that still in the end ends up with the Palestinians. And I'm not talking particularly on what authority or where and when, but at least to have the ownership of the Palestinians. And there we have, as European Union, obviously a concern. We have expressed this because we do support that political horizon, and we do feel there has to be a very clear role for everybody in this. So I think 2026, hopefully it will start with all these announcements we are waiting for now. It's true, a lot has been prepared, it will come up, but that we can get actually the whole machinery going in an operational setting where you actually have a table where as many good, willing and constructive and collegial actors are around that table to make the plan work. That is, I think, now of key essence from our perspective.
Thank you, Angelina. So moving on, but while the South simmered in diplomacy, the North teetered on the edge of war. The Lebanon-Israel front remained volatile in 2025. A spring escalation gave way to sustained low-level clashes as strategic signaling. Hezbollah demonstrated new capabilities. Israel expanded its targeting depth, and Lebanon's internal collapse shaped Hezbollah's risk posture. Despite moments of acute danger, both sides opted for restraint, leaving the northern front dangerously unstable. Angelina, let me start with you. Why both sides chosen restraint? What stopped this from becoming a full-scale war?
Yeah, there are many elements there, but I think in the first key element is, and I've served in Lebanon. I've been still observing Lebanon whenever since I left. You can't leave Lebanon. This is impossible. But the point is that there is a clear government in place that, again, I use the same words, that want to make things work. And I think we have to acknowledge also that all the efforts that have been made to comply with the different agreements that were made, they are there. They are not always out there in the media. That's the issue, because you get sort of the negativity. But I think Hezbollah has had a complete blow for all the reasons we know, and you feel also there's a sense at popular level that people really want now to get into the disarmament, to get into the full scale of back to Lebanon sovereignty as a state. That is the role of the army, clearly today working on. But we need to help them to do so. So that means also that the ceasefire has to be complied by from both sides very clearly. And we need to acknowledge what the government is trying to do at this point. So I think why are both sides sort of holding? Because one, we cannot afford, I guess the region cannot afford a further escalation. We have, and we will talk about the others in a minute. So there is that fatigue for sure. But there's also, you're forced for time, because UNIFIL is we know where that now is at this point in time. You need to have different mechanisms in place to make actually the whole set of agreements that were made to make it work. And again, I come back to the necessity, but also the understanding and the goodwill on the side of Lebanon to move ahead.
Thank you, Angelina. Dennis, how linked is this front to the broader Israel-Iran confrontation, and what are the implications for 2026?
Well, it is linked to it because it's pretty clear that Iran right now is trying to help Hezbollah reconstitute itself,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of providing monies, but also in terms of trying to get arms to it. It's harder than it was before because it doesn't have Syria as as a kind of land
Buffer.
bridge. Well, basically, it was a land bridge that that provided the arms. So it's more complicated, but that Iran hasn't stopped. And Hezbollah, is threatening the Lebanese government that if they try to disarm it, that'll cause a civil war. And the Lebanese don't want a civil war. Ironically, as Angelina was saying, I'll say ironic, right now Hezbollah doesn't want it either. One of the most interesting things is Israel acts against what it says is the violation of the ceasefire agreement because Hezbollah is not disarming. And Hezbollah at this point hasn't retaliated. Now, for me, that's quite telling.
Mm-hmm.
Now, partly it's a function that they've been dramatically weakened. But it's ironic they can say they can be dramatically weakened on the one hand, and yet they can threaten civil war if the Lebanese government seeks to carry out its decision to disarm them. So that says they're not that weak as it relates to the Lebanese military, but they haven't retaliated. And what that tells me is they actually understand where the Lebanese public is. The Lebanese public doesn't want them to retaliate. The Lebanese public doesn't want a resumption of the war. And Hezbollah at this point is trying to manage its own effort to reconstitute without triggering a war, which may in fact further isolate it within Lebanon. I think there are some lessons here as it relates to Hamas, by the way. When we talk about how do you create a different level of public pressure, whether it's on Hezbollah or it's on Hamas, I think there's a tendency to underestimate the value of public pressure.
Yes.
Isolating Hamas, isolating Hezbollah is something that matters to them. In each case, they define themselves as being organically, in the Hamas case, organically part of the Palestinian people, in the case of Hezbollah, organically part of the Lebanese. And when it becomes clear that they're isolated, that creates a problem for them. Now, is that enough to ensure you get disarmament in each case? I don't know, but I would say we should be thinking about how you create a climate where it isn't so easy for either Hamas or Hezbollah to resist the issue of disarmament. Of course, it's profoundly hard for each because they're defined by mukawama, they're defined by resistance. That goes to the heart of their identity. But the fact is, there are competing sources of identity, and there are competing pressures they have to contend with. So we need to be smart enough about how you build a kind of collective level of pressure on them, a collective effort to sort of delegitimize their effort to resist the issue of disarming. You didn't ask a question, you asked how it links to the Iranians, but I would say this is a reminder of not so much an overt linkage, but there's a psychological reality that defines the landscape right now. We have Iran dramatically weaker than it was. We have all the regional proxies dramatically weaker than they were, but we haven't had a clear strategy, a political strategy to take advantage of that and to cement what are these changes. I think that needs to be very much a part of what is done in 2026. I think all those internationally who want to see that outcome need to think in terms of how they can contribute to creating the right mix of pressures and inducements to produce changes in the behavior of both Hezbollah and Hamas.
Thank
If I
you.
may come in on this.
Can I just say one last point?
Yes.
Clearly, there have to be pressures on this Israeli government as well. But it's also clear there is one actor here, meaning the US, meaning President Trump, who has the ability to apply leverage on Israel and specifically on this prime minister and this government. It's very hard for this prime minister to say no to President Trump. He doesn't have the option that he had with Democrats, where he could turn to the Republicans. Republicans will not back him over Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He's alienated Democrats already, so he can't turn to them. So it's not like he has a built-in constituency that if President Trump says this is what you need to do, that he can easily resist it. Now
Yes.
there is an election year in Israel, and that may affect some of the choices. But in a sense, if President Trump is applying his leverage, it also means that others need to apply their leverage as it relates to Hamas and Hezbollah.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to jump on what Dennis said rightly about creating that environment where, disarmament is going to be, that this is the reason I believe why President Aoun was so clear on his 5 points on negotiations with Israel directly. I believe that the thinking is this would actually create that framework within which, there will be no space anymore. Once you have these negotiations ongoing under US auspices or others, but you're right, the US plays a key role in this. That would actually create that right, I would think, right environment for 226.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bashir, I'm going to ask the quiet part out loud here. Has the deterrence become a myth that we tell ourselves to avoid admitting that no one really knows how to avoid the next war?
Well, the whole issue of I think the whole premise of containment and management, and here I might just disagree with many. I don't think that fundamentally the mode of management of sticky and chronic issues in the Middle East has proven capable of maintaining and sustaining calm and stability in any manner, fashion, or way. I think the constant upsetter so far, history teaches us, has been the absence of Palestinian-Israeli resolution. And it has been a constant, frankly, upsetter to Middle East stability at large. And let me segue and say that the full potential of the Camp David Accords that were signed in 1977 between Israel and Egypt, the Jordan-Israel peace treaty, subsequently the Abrahamic Accords, they failed to basically realize their full potential absent a dimension pertaining to resolving the core Palestinian-Israeli dimension, which I think will remain to be a constant upsetter, contrary to what many people might believe otherwise. The test that I use is, for example, a project that was extremely promising just before the outbreak of the October 7th attack. We had negotiations with the Emiratis, with the Israelis that were shepherded by Secretary Kerry, who was the special envoy for the environment of the Biden administration, on a project whereby Jordan would fundamentally provide through an Emirati company clean energy to Israel, and in return Jordan would get water at a reduced price and quantities from Israel. And that entire project came crumbling once the October 7th attacks happened, and once the Israeli retaliation began, because it was not something that was fundamentally sellable, and we missed the deadline. I think that basically deterrence in the classical sense is not something, and probably the October 7th attack and also the Israeli subsequent attacks on the Israeli nuclear facilities, on the missile production sites, on the air defenses, is something that has proven that there's a lot of vulnerability with this whole concept of deterrence, whereby today, if it's conducted on a unilateral basis by each country, it's not going to be a formula that's workable. Today, I have a general feeling that the region is at a crossroads where it can either slide back into the quagmire of the reemergence of violence, the reemergence of terrorist forces like ISIS that still operate in certain parts of Syria, that are dormant but there in certain parts of Iraq, along with Al-Qaeda, if we do not grasp the moment and fundamentally think about erecting and devising a comprehensive regional architecture, and a comprehensive regional architecture that does not involve security alone, because that does not cut it. It has to have a political pillar whereby we resolve the core problems of the region. Chiefly among them, for Israel to be basically a player, would be a commitment on the part of Israel, at least to maintain the existing status quo today, to keep the prospect of a two-state solution alive at some point in the future, when the conditions in Israel are right after a series of CBMs that could last for a few years, are in place for the resumption of that political track. It would have to entail strengthening the national state. It would have to entail a comprehensive security architecture that is devised by the countries of the region in a manner that sufficiently addresses the legitimate security grievances of various countries, including understandings on how to manage and deal with achieving a full nuclear cycle for civilian purposes versus clandestine programs aimed at militarizing the nuclear technology. And definitely coupled with the developmental dimension, economic cooperation dimension that can unleash the power of this region in a multitude of ways, including the abundance and the availability of capital today, the region becoming gradually a hub and a major player, particularly in the Gulf, with emerging technologies. AI has been put in that particular sphere. But that architecture, if it is to be erected again, it needs heavy American leaning in, particularly on Israel to play ball. And definitely that architecture has to be an architecture that solidifies the nation state and that addresses the real threat and emerging threat of the re-emergence of sub-state actors and terrorist groups, and to comprehensively then erect a platform that addresses that challenge and deals with it swiftly in the context of that comprehensive regional architecture. It's too romantic to think about it, but frankly speaking, I think that this is one dimension that can provide a package that probably ushers in sustained and permanent stability in the region. On Lebanon, if you allow me, on Lebanon, while time, I think, and I agree with Dennis and the ambassador in Cairo, while I agree that time is of essence in putting the structures in place, whether the Board of Peace, the Executive Committee, the Palestinian Committee, quite swiftly and hopefully before the end of the year in the case of Gaza, and begin to deal with the questions attending to the second phase and disarmament and disarming Hamas and Israeli withdrawals. I think time becomes maybe giving the Lebanese government that is quite serious in doing business, as Angelina put it, giving it the sufficient time to have the necessary alignments that would help it generate further social and societal leverage becomes of essence, and not to basically be hastened about that aspect in a manner that would then maybe threaten the advent of conditions in Lebanon that could lead to an internal strife and that could lead to a civil war. They're saying the right thing, they're doing the right thing. But generally, Hezbollah is embedded within an existing constituency in Lebanon that is quite sizable, that still today is quite skeptical about the shape and form of the new government in Syria. And they're looking at that from the prism of that, potentially, from their view, a Sunni force that might be aiming at also violently dealing with them and addressing them. So they're basically also probably pivoting around Hezbollah on the premise of that perceived threat until the new government in Syria projects clearly to them that it is not a threat to any sectarian denomination in the region, including the Shiites in Lebanon, which is next door. So while time is of essence in setting up the structures necessary in Gaza, and to segue into a broader political horizon that could see the advent of a comprehensive regional architecture and a plan for the region that's quite grandiose. In the case of Lebanon, I think that basically reasonable time given to the government that is acting and working and doing and saying the right thing is quite important, and not to keep basically breathing down the neck of the government with artificial deadlines. And if hastened into that, it will not basically have neither the objective means of dealing with the question of disarmament as a result of the lack of synergy in force between the Lebanese army and between Hezbollah. And of course, the realization that there are elements from the Shia sect who are part and parcel of the Lebanese army, and one has to basically think about where they would stand in the context of such a confrontation, and just give the Lebanese government, in this case, the needed time to deal with this issue and to address it. And this can be definitely facilitated immensely by a more prudent Israeli government in its general behavior vis-a-vis Lebanon, vis-a-vis the continued presence in 5 points today in a manner that's not consistent with the ceasefire agreement that was brokered about a year ago. They're still at the 5 points, and they're still constructing a wall now within and between those 5 points in Lebanon.
Thank you, Bisher. We could talk about this, I think, for hours, but let's move on. And while rockets traded silence in the north, missiles began to haunt the sea. The Red Sea reemerged as a major flashpoint in 2025, with Houthi attacks on commercial shipping surging after a brief lull. What began as a localized threat evolved into a long-term conflict zone involving Houthis, Iran, the US, and key regional states. Despite the intensified US-led naval operation, the Houthis maintained their capabilities and political leverage. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE recalibrated their maritime strategies as shipping routes shifted permanently around the Cape of Good Hope. Dennis, what does the Red Sea crisis reveal about Iran's evolving influence? And how long can the US-led naval presence realistically be sustained if the conflict drags into 2026? Which it looks like it will, but so.
Look, I think the Houthis are an instrument for the Iranians, but not one that they completely control. The Houthis are a force that know how to fight, but they don't know how to govern. And they have an ideology, they have a sense of identity. The greatest threat to them would come from within. And unless somehow they see that their own capacity to rule is threatened, and I'm not quite sure how you do that other than by having a local partner, and I'm not sure there is a local partner right now. It's pretty hard to see how that changes. Iran can use them on the one hand to create leverage on others, but it doesn't mean they can, as I said, control them. The Iranians at certain points might emphasize the need for the Houthis not to act as part of some kind of deal. Because I mean, the truth is, for the Iranians, this is a useful lever. It's a useful lever on the Saudis. It's a useful lever on others, who want to use the Red Sea. But does Iran control the Houthis enough to get them to stop? I don't see that necessarily. I'm not sure that the U.S. naval presence that you're referring to is quite what it was, number one. The U.S., after all, spent about 30 days bombing the Houthis and then worked out what was a ceasefire that was exclusively between the U.S. and the Houthis. The Houthis said, they would still attack those connected to Israel, but their definition of those connected to Israel pretty much includes any ship that wants to go through there that may not be American flag. So I don't think there's an easy answer to the Houthis. I think the Saudis would like to ensure that this remains calm. The Iranians want to remind everybody that they can, they have the ability to cause trouble at a time when actually they don't have a huge interest in creating trouble. The Iranian focus increasingly, notwithstanding what they're doing to try to rearm Hezbollah, they certainly would have an interest in trying to rearm Hamas. I think they're probably somewhat active as it relates to Sudan, but they don't have an interest in another conflict right now. The last thing they want is to give the Israelis a reason to attack them. They're quite, they still have no air defense, meaning Israel would have complete mastery of the air, number one. Number two, this is a country, talk about failure of governance. to have the president of Iran say they may have to evacuate parts of the city of Tehran because of water shortages, you can't have a more profound statement of terrible governance than that.
Yes.
The
Yes.
reservoir around Tehran, all the top reservoirs around Tehran are at 10 to 15% of what they should be at. The electricity is also shut off for part of the day. Water is not available for part of the day. The currency has been devalued to the point where it's largely valueless. This is a regime, by the way, that is not enforcing the hijab law, which supreme leaders always refer to as one of the pillars of the Islamic Republic. They're not enforcing it for a reason, because they don't want to trigger a reaction from the public. So they can maintain their control, but they're clearly increasingly mindful. So the question about what they do with the Houthis, okay, maybe they will continue to do that, but they'll do it within bounds because they really don't have an interest in this coming back and threatening them.
Bisher, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I largely actually agree with Dennis's analysis vis-a-vis the nature of the relationship between the Houthis and between Iran. But also to add that also their general kinetic activity in as much as interrupting the global navigation vis-a-vis Bab el-Mandeb is slightly reduced, and you have to also observe very closely the schisms within Yemen. And basically just today, if you look at certain reverberations vis-a-vis Haydarus al-Ubaidi, you can basically see that the landscape is quite complex, and potentially they will have to deal with other local forces within Yemen in a certain context that could limit their power, or and I hope not, that could probably lead to the disintegration and split of Yemen into two, which is becoming in many ways a real possibility that we would not like to see, but potentially that can happen. And if it does, then part of that geographic advantage vis-a-vis being present on Bab el-Mandeb will also erode, and the significance strategically of their geographic presence there would be more challenged. And I agree that Iran doesn't probably want to pick a fight today, does not want to give pretext for the resumption of any hostile military operations and activities against it. It does not mean that the mindset of the Iranians is one of capitulation and surrender. And this is why diplomatically one has to caution that this is not exactly the mindset of the Iranians, while at the same time, the Iranians, I think they're masterful in being pragmatic in the administration of their domestic and external policy in general. So basically, they will desist from provoking a military reaction and action against them. And what matters most for them today is how to deal with the issue of the nuclear program above anything else. They would not want to invite anything else that can basically cloud the issue of aiming to secure and score on the issue of retaining the ability to master a full fuel cycle and enrichment within Iran. So I tend to largely agree with Dennis on that.
Angelina?
Mani, in that whole picture, I think it's a fair question to ask how effective have the Houthis really been? Apart from, as was mentioned by Bisher, completely, pretty much destroying, the whole shipping, the vessel, the toll revenues. We know the figures for Egypt, but that goes for the whole Red Sea. We have put in.
May I jump in? I mean, I can definitely tell you about 2023 because I was basically Prime Minister. I can tell you that basically we had a shortfall in projected revenues by 1,200,000,000 Jordanian dinars. 70% of those were fundamentally attributed to the tensions in the Red Sea and the rerouting of.
I was going to come to that, Bisher. No, you're absolutely right. We should never forget. And it has had tremendous negative effect on the EU. I mean, the whole Mediterranean and certainly As I said, the figures in Egypt were and still are pretty dramatic. This is a fact. But I was talking more about the efficiency in terms of getting whatever message it is through, because let us just assume that as long as the ceasefire holds, and once we go into phase two, et cetera, what is left there, right?
Mhm.
Let's be very
Mhm.
frank. And I agree with you, Bisher. We all have to look now at what is happening in Yemen internally and Hadramaut elsewhere. This is hopefully it can all be contained with very wise people, but there are too many elements that make it again so complex for Yemen, that I hope we don't need to gear up for other events that would also affect the Red Sea quite clearly. What it has done on our end and on different actors. European Union finally, I argued it for many years, is working on a Red Sea strategy, right? Egypt has a Red Sea strategy now. It's they presented it at the Aswan Forum. Others have. Egypt actually now has, through its protection of the sea border, on the Red Sea border, more invested in ports, in border protection. That work should have been obviously done years ago, but it's all there now. And there's a very big urge, as you know very well, through different connections. It brings me to the connectivity, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the investments, the huge investments that the Red Sea could bring, that, as we all aware of, this really is bringing sort of the heads together of let's try and invest more in this region. And that brings me back to the Houthis' effectiveness and efficiency there in terms of what they want to do. But Yemen needs a close watch for 226 as well,
Mhm.
unfortunately, for the reasons mentioned.
Thank you. So, from the waters of the Red Sea to the shadows of the Persian Gulf, another front was quietly escalating. One of the most overt Israel-Iran confrontations in decades, Israeli strikes targeted Iranian missile infrastructure, prompting a limited Iranian retaliation, revealing both capability and restraint. This unfolds against the backdrop of deepening internal crisis, as Dennis mentioned, a water emergency, mounting protest, economic strain, and rising debate over political transition. 2025 laid bare the tension between Iran's external aggression and internal vulnerability. So, Angelina, have traditional red lines between Israel and Iran shifted this year, or are both still playing by old rules under new pressures? What did the limited retaliation cycle reveal about deterrence dynamics?
Yeah, it's a tricky one for us for many reasons. I think the way we're seeing it for now, we are having a pause, if I may say so, on this,
Hmm.
since, and I'm just saying it because I am still in office, other than Denise and Bishop, but I can see
Hmm.
how institutionally it works for the moment. We all geared to crisis after crisis after crisis, as we were at the time when the escalation happened. But what the efforts that have been trying to do, sort of politically, to send the messages to Iran that needed to be sent, they have not been bearing fruit in the way we at least wanted to.
Hmm.
And I think you are at the point now that perhaps things may look a bit quiet. But Dennis said it before, and others too, that we need to see what 226 will bring
Hmm.
for the Iranian side. This is not over at all.
No.
And it doesn't get now our institutional priority attention as we have been giving it for a long time, because of all the other elements in the region. But I can just say that I hope we will not be very busy on Iran next year. I hope that there is a sense of the need of what needs to be done. The parameters are out there, what we are asking from Iran to do.
Hmm.
And well, I'm not in the business of hope. I shouldn't say that. But since I'm still in office, I mean, we have to work on some of these parameters of saying, use some. But I see for the moment, my point on this one is there is at this point in time, very little active diplomacy because of the directions elsewhere in the region.
Mhm. Dennis, if Iran is both unstable at home and aggressive abroad, why has the world stopped trying to shape behavior in either space?
Well, I think Angelina just pointed out, it's almost like there's too many different fronts and there's only so much attention. And the immediate risk of a resumption of conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians seems to have been reduced. So this is a classic case of the urgent pushing out the important.
Mhm.
I still think there is a danger here. The Iranians are trying to reconstitute their air defense. They seem to be having more success because of Chinese help in terms of reconstituting their ballistic missiles. I worry that for the Israelis, there's a kind of threshold there that could trigger them to act again. This would be a good opportunity for diplomacy. The Iranians could claim, we should be able to rebuild our forces, but if those forces look like they could trigger and be responsible for triggering a new conflict, this is a time for the US to be talking to the Chinese and for the Europeans to be talking to the Chinese, maybe for the Arabs to be talking to the Chinese. The more you provide to the Iranians in this regard, the more likely a conflict in 2026 could take place. This is
Mhm.
not in Chinese interest at all. The last thing
Yeah.
they should want is that. So I think that should be a focal point. I wouldn't give up on the idea even of diplomacy. It's pretty clear to me that the Iranians, I think Bisher said it before, they still want the fuel cycle. They still want to be able to enrich domestically. I think that is a red line for the United States, no
Mhm.
doubt a red line for the Israelis. But I wonder whether or not there isn't some room there where there's an understanding that the Iranians will not enrich, even if they don't have to necessarily give up their right to enrich. Creative diplomacy would say, okay, let's do something that's practical that reduces the risk that ultimately could be in Iran's interests as well. One other point I want to make. I think it's very difficult to see any fundamental change in Iran so long as the supreme leader is alive.
Mhm.
But you certainly see signs of debate and dissonance within the Iranian elite. There are those who ask the question, and why did we pour all this money into our regional proxy network? At least 40 billion within Syria, that's all gone. Huge investment in Hezbollah, and that all down the drain, and you're putting more in.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, they probably invested $500 billion over the last 40 years in their nuclear infrastructure, and most of that has been destroyed. It hasn't been obliterated, and it can be rebuilt. But again, the resources you put into that, you're not putting into things that your public clearly desperately needs and is unhappy.
Like
Uh,
water. Yeah.
Fundamental, I said, basic
Yeah.
governance.
Mhm.
So there are those who are raising questions like that. I think as long as the supreme leader is there, he isn't necessarily rethinking his fundamental approach. I'm not sure he's capable of that. But I'm also not sure that he's taking the advice of those who said that they had good military options. When he started last April in trying to strike Israel,
Mhm.
he was told they would be able to inflict great damage on Israel and they would be able to prevent Israel from doing much to Iran. Well, that turned out to be pretty much wrong. So he's also someone who, it's worth noting, he doesn't tend to appear in public very often anymore.
Mhm.
This is also a country that sees Israeli ghosts everywhere. I mean, they've arrested well over 20,000 people. They aren't all Israeli agents. And what that does is it probably makes their security establishment a whole lot less functional than it was. So I'm not saying the Iranian threat necessarily goes away, because I don't think it's gone away. But I'm saying they are much weaker than they were. And there's at least some questions that have been raised about, was it so smart to adopt the strategy that they had?
Thank you. Bashir, do you think changes that have social changes that we've seen in Saudi Arabia over the past 10, 15 years, do you think it could realistically happen in Iran now, seeing that they're not enforcing the hijabi laws, and the people have spoken, they're not happy. Do you see a change happening there as we've seen now in Saudi?
It could happen, but this would be basically a tactical step as opposed to a strategic decision that was taken in Saudi Arabia in a manner that's
Hmm.
quite sober and that aligned instantly and immediately with around 75% of the population, which is the youth. It was very
Hmm.
common. And this is a change that we have basically witnessed in just a few years. It can happen as a tactical aspect in Iran. It can happen as a result of, frankly speaking, to put it this way, in the context of sometimes a certain amount of hypocrisy that does exist.
Hmm.
Because I've been told that they don't enforce the hijab and they don't enforce many other things that are associated with the model of clergy rule.
Hmm.
Uh, but what I want to say is I still believe that it's quite volatile. I think we're still on thin ice vis-a-vis the question of the resumption of hostilities. The mindset of the Iranians is, in my estimation, quite pragmatic, that they're weakened, but they're not defeated.
Hmm.
I think in many aspects they genuinely believe that they still possess a deterrent vis-a-vis Israel by just making missiles reach Israel and hit certain sites and civilian installations in Israel, even without precision. But this is something that they feel provides them with an asymmetrical tool to be able to counter the precision of the Israeli strikes. I don't entirely agree with Dennis about the level of the vulnerability of the system internally in Iran, and maybe the Israeli action militarily served as at least temporarily as a rallying point around the system in general. Particularly because they've managed to associate it with a project that even before the revolution in 1979 was a national a project pertaining to an element of national pride. Even during the time of the Shah, there was a pursuit of a nuclear energy option in Iran. Uh, uh, I fully agree with Dennis on the question of feeble governance, which is frustrating the general public, but I don't necessarily think that the regime internally is on thin ice at all. I think they're weakened, but they don't perceive themselves as defeated. They will attempt to steer away from inducing a resumption in confrontation, but they will not invite voluntarily the same set of social and societal change underpinned by a strategic decision that comes in conformity with the wishes of the people as the Saudi model did. But they would do it tactically just to assuage anger.
I think it would help, to be honest. Um, I mean, it would help the citizens of Iran for sure. I don't know about how it would help them on the world stage. It's to be seen, I suppose.
It's I don't think that this is basically today at the epicenter of how the system would be defined globally. It is not that yardstick of openness and not enforcing certain laws associated with a clerical model of governance that would basically clean up certain credentials in on the international plane. And I don't know whether Dennis and Angelina would agree with on
I,
that.
I, I
I
very
agree.
much agree with that. I don't see, look, there is no, I qualified it by saying as long as the supreme leader is there,
Yes.
no capacity for change. Uh,
Hmm.
there may be a change after he's gone, but I'm not sure it's going to be in the direction that we would like to see. You might end up with again with a pragmatic leadership, but it might be dominated by the Revolutionary Guard. That's what I think is the most likely future picture within Iran.
And we've seen such a division and model at some points in the past
Yeah,
Hmm.
that did not end up transforming the system.
right, exactly.
Hmm. All right, guys, not every crisis came with fanfare this year. Some, like Sudan, unfolded in silence. and with devastating cost. The UN Level 3 emergency designation for Sudan reflects a catastrophic conflict, mass displacement, famine warnings, and violence nearing Port Sudan. But international engagement remains limited, while Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia pursue divergent strategies. With regional spillover risks rising, Sudan is quickly becoming Africa's most destabilizing crisis and one that's unfolding largely outside of the spotlight.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, why does Sudan remain so absent from global diplomatic focus? And what will it take for the international system to treat this crisis with the urgency it deserves? Angelina?
Yeah, we got this point, question, observation, what call you, throughout the whole year.
Mm,
Why are you not more vocal about Sudan? Why don't you say more the whole humanitarian system as well, everything before Al-Fashir and then after Al-Fashir for sure? I just want to say a few points here that as the EU, we have continued since the war started, actually since 21, when the Prime Minister Hamdok, when he resigned, we have been engaging really with all parties, but we could not recognize one against the other. We have not done
mm-hmm,
so, and we will not do so. What we would recognize is what we would call a civilian-led political government structure that follows a certain transition. And we we actually thought that there were elements that were bringing us to that point, because
mm-hmm,
there was quite some work ongoing in the region, which is not always in US or in EU media or even globally, etc. There was quite some, because I think for a few reasons. One, don't forget the Sudan crisis is, apart from all the agony and the pain for the people of Sudan, it is an enormously important crisis to be resolved when it comes to Egypt's interest. For Egypt from day one, when in April 23, but even before, these are deep relations people have at people level, also at structures at government level. And Egypt has been investing quite a lot in trying to at least find a way out of an inclusivity and preserving institutions. That's always how Egypt mentioned the point, and working with all the actors. And
mm-hmm,
Egypt, as you rightly said, they are very active in the Quad format. And the Quad, when they came out in September, and basically with a real call for, we need a ceasefire here, and it's important to hold. You saw this is supported by European Union, obviously, no doubt. But that was a result of quite some quiet diplomacy, not quite per se, but at least not out there in the open.
mm-hmm,
And a lot of contacts with all the sides. We have a special envoy as well for the Horn. The United States has, many actors. But again, it would not just reach page one or Twitter one or whatever it is, number one on
yeah,
your feed. Um, um, and when Fasher happened, actually, the whole horrible drama of this and the huge pain incurred. I mean, it still comes always back to the point of, you want to hold this country together, and you need parties to work with each other. That's it's a European way of saying things, but it's really in the end what is needed. You need to have a political process. How else can you make things happen? And we have been quite clear on all the work on that with the Quad, but also we are co-chairing Paris and London conferences. But
mm-hmm,
even I'm also accredited to the League of Arab States. Even in the League of Arab States,
mm-hmm,
Sudan has been one of the most complex issues to find consensus around, to see, concerted actions to be worked out, to stop the violence for all the reasons we know, because of there are so many different actors involved. In diplomacy, we always say there are too many cooks in the kitchen, but we know the result is dramatic. We see it on the ground, and you can see also that um, again, if there is not an important media attention like with Al Fashir, that indeed everybody talks about it already now. What are we today? 9th of December.
mm-hmm,
Far less far less people talk about Sudan one more time.
Yes.
Despite the
Hmm.
engagement, the United States isn't very much engaged as well. Despite everything that we are trying to do on getting humanitarian assistance in again, getting really working on this civilian governance, working with the different parties, get the accountability, rule of law, all of that, which the European Union does with so many partners. You can see that this unfortunately this part, it may, because of the entrenched interest of the different parties who are involved, this may take still some time. And I'm just repeating it. It's one of the crisis that has the most impact in the relations between Arab partners, relations on the African continent, in the Horn, obviously, also in
Hmm.
North Africa, that therefore would actually deserve all the attention it would get, not let alone talking about the huge number of victims that the crisis has brought forward.
Definitely. Thank you, Angelina. Bashir, do you have any thoughts on Sudan?
Frankly, just to basically say that atrocities are quite omnipresent everywhere. Al-Fashir was
Yeah.
basically a flashpoint that received media attention, that sort of leaked to the media, while we know that atrocities existed on both ends of the warring parties in Sudan and on the hands of followers of the both warring parties in Sudan. The Quad remains to be the best mechanism going forward. And I think that basically one should attempt to focus on the commonalities in diverging positions among Arab countries. And one of those commonalities that are repeatedly underscored by all of the Arab countries is the need to move forward with transitioning through a political process to a civilian government that's elected in Sudan. And honestly, I think it's very legitimate to basically also ensure that that civilian government, once we reach that point, is not a government that is the product of or that reflects a representation of one religious political factor that would take us back into monopolizing the political scene in Lebanon by using the democratic methods on the premise of a one man, one vote, one bus stop, and then we reverse the entire process. This is which is the modus operandi of some of those movements, including the MPs that are
Hmm.
now that are now finding themselves into designations as terrorist organizations in a multitude of places, including the states, including the U.S., including in certain states within the U.S. And I think that basically the way by which this particular movement has affected domestic reverberations politically in Sudan over the past 25, 30 years and maybe remains is a complicating factor. So this is one other issue that has to basically also be addressed through a political process that ensures that they do not again monopolize the political process to serve a political objective and a political agenda, and to really allow Sudan to sort of breathe again, because the trouble in Sudan and the volatility in Sudan and the difficulty in living conditions in Sudan have been living with us for the past 35 years. And we stand today the risk of further friction within Sudan, whether in the east, west, or other parts. We already
Hmm.
have Sudan and South Sudan, but those disintegrations can basically happen in other places, including again in Darfur.
Thank you. Dennis, real quick, do you think Egypt, the UAE, or Saudi Arabia have any real leverage left in Sudan? Or are they just spectators to the conflict now?
I think they have some, but I think the nature of the actors in Sudan are such that they find it quite possible to resist any pressure from the outside.
Hmm.
You can exert some, but it doesn't seem that much changes. I think, the original question you asked is, why does this conflict get such little attention internationally?
Hmm.
It isn't for the loss of lives or the suffering. It was at one point Darfur did get a lot of attention.
It
Uh,
did, yeah.
it should be getting it again. I think part of the explanation is it doesn't have outside governments, it doesn't have champions. Activists around the globe don't identify with this.
Mm-hmm.
And ask, why is that true in the case of Gaza? Why is it not true in the case of Sudan?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I'd say, why isn't it true in the Congo? If you look at the numbers of people who've been killed there, the numbers dwarf anything else. For whatever reasons, and we could speculate on those reasons, there aren't those who organize around that conflict and organize big demonstrations. It doesn't capture the imagination of some. I can speculate on it, but I don't see that it offers much chance to change it. I bemoan it. I think all three of us bemoan it because the level of death there and destruction and just the horrific nature of the landscape there and what has happened, as Bisher said, over the last 35 years.
Yeah.
It's almost incomprehensible. And maybe because it's gone on so long, people have become inert to it, but it's never really had champions who said, we're going to make this an issue. We're going to require the world to pay attention to it. We're going to carry out protests and demonstrations until something's done about it. That just doesn't exist.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and there's two of the topics that I really wanted to get your feedback on, but I think we have to move over. But the last question is for each of you. What are your predictions for the future in 2026 for the region? It's just a simple, off the cuff question.
Hopes or predictions?
Let's
I'm hoping, at least if I may go, Dennis, would you allow me, Angelina, very quickly? I'm hoping
I was going to suggest it.
I'm hoping that President Trump is sufficiently energized by the traction that was generated and mostly credited to him on the front of the ceasefire, the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, and that he manages to sustain his engagement with the comprehensive Gaza plan. And to be able to basically invest at some point in time in really generating the much needed political horizon, because a lot of the regional stability and a lot of the topics that we have talked about, in my humble belief and estimation, hinge and result directly from the absence of that type of political engagement on the front of having that political horizon between the Israelis and Palestinians, with hope that we will go in the direction of a two-state solution. I think that probably he is incentivized. I'm extremely hopeful that we will see a positive emerging Iraqi landscape that in turn would probably also look at the national priorities of Iraq as opposed to Iraq being a mirror image of the priorities of other regional powers. And to see Iraq more lured in the direction of the Arab sphere, the Arab space today. I'm certainly hopeful that if we have a political horizon that's credible, irreversible on the Palestinian front, that would expand the scope of formalized peace in the region, because I don't see that formalization with the major powers happening absent sufficient irreversible traction and pathway on that direction. And frankly speaking, I would hope that this happens, because I also think that other regional upsetters would be denied a lot of their allure and attractivity if that happens, to basically mobilize around the grievances of the Palestinians, mobilize ranks around the grievances of the Palestinians, while that mobilization in essence has nothing to do with the legitimate Palestinian grievances but domestic agendas. Will this happen? I don't know. It's too much to wish for, but I certainly wish that happens, and that we return to an era at some point in time quickly to an era that preceded the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, because the region looked much more hopeful at that point in time.
Thank you, Bisher. Angelina?
Yeah, I think, for next year, we have a lot of wishes, but we need to work very forcefully on we said on many of these files dossiers. The time is pressing. We haven't really unpacked even Syria, where perhaps you could say there are sparks of hope there, and we cannot do that in one sentence. I wouldn't do any good to Syria. I would have loved to discuss indeed Algeria, Morocco, other subjects, Tunisia, because we are also, from Brussels' perspective, we are much more politically again engaging, but from that point of we need to reestablish that equilibrium and feel that when you work on win-wins, you can agree to disagree, it's no problem, but you really need to keep that conversation going. And our approach has always been to have as many as around the table as possible, because one actor cannot do it alone. And my fear is a bit that we are increasingly divided in different areas. That goes institutionally, international actors, and then actors in the region. And I think it needs that particular effort of saying, we may not agree on everything here, but we have a plan, we have a direction, we have an objective, and we're going to try and make this work for all the reasons we know. I think that will be our work, which is we're doing in any case on any basis. But nobody can predict. If you would ask me to predict, that's the last thing I would try to do, because the velocity, the speed of change in this region now, it's unprecedented. Every 2 or 3 days, I'm struck by, again, completely new developments none of us could have predicted. So there's nothing here about predictions or expected, I should say. There is something about doing analysis based on lessons learned from the past, which we are not always very good at. To be very, very frank on that. There's a good stuff about trying new things that have not been tried. I admit immediately, perhaps the past 30 years, the different approach to the region just has not paid off at all. We look at what we have today. But you cannot be too impulsive on too many things, because there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge out there we need to continue to build on, and particularly from our partners in the region, because whatever is imposed, it doesn't hold if there's no real ownership from the actors here. So that will be my pitch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Angelina. Dennis?
Well, I'll pick up on the last thing that Angelina said. There does need to be basically buy-in from actors in the region. And actually, this gives me one reason to be more hopeful. I do see on the Arab side a greater readiness to assume a bigger role and responsibility on the Palestinian issue.
Yep.
Historically, I can tell you, when I was a negotiator, I know what the attitude was. It was up to us. You have to fix it.
Yep.
That's changing. It may not be completely where I'd like to see it, but it's clearly changing. One of the issues I will say on the Palestinian side, look at point 19. Bisher has talked several times about the need for a political horizon. Point 19 of the 20 points says, if the Palestinian Authority faithfully carries out reform, that could create the pathway for self-determination and statehood, which addresses the aspirations of the Palestinian people. Well, there you have the kernel of a horizon, but it's conditioned on if the Palestinian Authority faithfully carries out reform. I can tell you, without Arab pushing and legitimizing reform on the Palestinian side, you're probably not going to get it. So I've often said, there is a need for us to play a role, and I completely agree with Bisher. One of the most important things is President Trump has to maintain the interest, because that's the only way this is going to continue to move. Why I think he may is because when you look at Russia, Ukraine, it doesn't look very promising to me. I see no prospect that Putin's prepared to change. And I don't see much evidence that President Trump's prepared to exert leverage on him. But he has a stake now in the Trump plan. I mean, having the Trump administration decide that it was okay to produce a Security Council resolution, that in itself is kind of a testament to the change, because to say that they don't exactly do handstands over support of the UN would be an understatement. So the fact is that they felt that was useful, says something about a recognition of what it takes to begin to get other actors involved who they will need. You need Trump to maintain the leverage. You need others to help make this happen. I think the role of the Arabs in terms of pushing, cajoling, supporting the PA as it reforms is critical to seeing point 19 fulfilled. It's critical to being able to see the transformation in Gaza. You can't talk about statehood if there isn't a political reunification of Gaza and the West Bank, and it's not going to happen on its own. So that gives me some reason to see a pathway. It gives me some reason to be hopeful. I will add one last word on Iraq. We'll see how long it takes for government formation, and we'll see who emerges from that government formation. There is an outcome there that could reflect very much what Bisher was saying, that Iraq becomes focused on Iraq and no longer being kind of the battleground between us and the Iranians.
Thank you, Dennis. So 2025 didn't deliver many clear resolutions, as we discussed, but it did leave us with sharper questions, and that's where we'll leave things for now. Thank you for joining us for this special year in review edition of the MENA Mix Regional Recap. A very heartfelt thanks to our guests, Ambassador Eichhorst, His Excellency Khasawneh, and Ambassador Ross for their clarity, candor, and generosity in unpacking a complex and consequential year. This marks the end of season 1. It's been a privilege to explore the region's shifting dynamics with all of you, and we look forward to returning in January with season 2, bringing fresh voices, deeper dives, and the same commitment to thoughtful, grounded perspectives on the Middle East and North Africa. This region never stays still, and neither will we at IMEO. Until then, thank you for listening, and we wish you a peaceful, reflective close to the year ahead.